Hi there, it's Kirsten McKenna, and today I've been invited to speak on the topic of change and change resilience. So let's get into it. The thing is that when we are faced with change, we have an initial innate response to resist it. And that's because we prefer a homeostatic state. We prefer our comfort zone. We prefer certainty, stability, calm foundation. And change goes against all of that. However, we do know that we need change in order to advance, in order to improve, in order to evolve. And so, what are the responses to change? Some of you may be familiar with the Kubler-Ross model of grief and our response to hearing the news that we have a terminal illness is where it actually originated from. It itself has evolved over time, and we use it now for everyday discussions around change in the business world and in our personal lives. The one thing to highlight about this change curve model is that it's not necessarily linear. Even though it says that as individuals, we move through these phases from shock all the way to integration in a timely fashion, a lot of the times that doesn't necessarily happen. We can have the initial feelings of shock and then move right to integration in a very short amount of time and not necessarily experience the other phases. However, some individuals might go through every phase and it might take them a long amount of time to get there. And that's why we all respond to change in different ways with different feelings, different emotions, different behaviors. And so to recognize that we all move through this change process at different speeds and go through different feelings and emotions and behaviors is really important, because then we can get to understand one another a lot better. But our initial resistance to change comes in the fact that we liked that comfort zone, we like that homeostatic state. And so when we get change that is different from what we've always done, it's a shock to the system, whether we've initiated it or it's been forced upon us. So if it's a cultural change with an organization, it can be a shock. If it's a change you've made, let's look at our lifestyles and look at the fact that perhaps we've all of a sudden started exercising, or we've all of a sudden changed our diet so that we're healthier. It's a shock to the system either way. And that's how our bodies respond, and that's how our minds respond, because it's different, and that's okay. We might then move into denial, where we don't believe that it's happening. We start to think that we don't have to be this strict and this regimented on our diet, or we perhaps think that the cultural change within the organization isn't going to last, that it's another phase, that we change all of the time. And that's where that denial comes in. We might get frustrated. And the frustration often stems from the fact that any type of change is difficult and challenging and takes strength on our parts. And from the fact that sometimes the change that we're encountering isn't by choice. And so we can get quite frustrated with it. We may even then move into a depressed state, feeling quite hopeless because of this sense of lack of control. We then start to experiment with what ifs, and this is where things might start to change for us. We're slowly getting on board to the change because we realize if we stay here, things aren't going to improve. And in order to move the dial, we're going to have to change. So we start experimenting with things. And then we make the decision to change. We have a final decision. We're all in. We're going to commit to this change. And that's when the integration happens. But again, we don't necessarily go through these 7 phases, and we don't necessarily do it in sequential order over a certain period of time. One person may be able to deal with change and make changes really quickly, really rapidly, and be comfortable with it in no time. And another person may take months, if not years, to make exactly the same change. So, what is it about those individuals who respond in a positive manner and move through the change curve in a rapid manner and come out the other end in a positive state? What is it about these individuals? What do they do? They do 3 very specific things. Number one is they get curious rather than fearful. And I'll give you an example that is close to my heart. My sister neglected to get on to internet banking. Okay, she was fearful. She thought someone was going to steal her identification, steal her money, all her credentials. And so to this day, she refrained from participating in internet banking. And it actually made her life harder. And so when you look at change, get curious about it. See what the potential positive impacts are going to be. Explore the negative and determine, do the positive outweigh the negative? Next is individuals who perform well through change get really comfortable being outside of their comfort zones. And this is something that takes practice. We know as human beings, we like the known, we like the certainty. And any type of change doesn't have the known, it doesn't have the certainty. It's quite volatile, it's quite ambiguous. And so we need to get comfortable being out there, putting ourselves out there, being vulnerable, not knowing. And then the last thing that these people do is that they focus on the things that they can control. And another personal example that came up for me when I was thinking about this was around my relationship with climate change and feeling as though I didn't really have much of a say. Yes, I could not use plastic, and yes, I could recycle, and yes, I could drive a hybrid car. But those felt like really small drops in the bucket of the bigger issue of climate change. And then I started exploring it more and more and more. And I found out that I could make more of an impact through focusing on one of the things I could control. And I switched my super. My superannuation was with one of the big banks, one of the big super funds. And I knew that they invested in fossil fuels and they did not invest in green technology. And so just by creating an awareness and really focusing on those things that I had control over, it enabled me to accept the changes that were happening in terms of climate change and in terms of what we could do as a society. It made it more impactful. And so when we focus on the things we can control, we have a high internal locus of control, and we feel as though we are much more equipped to deal with the change, regardless of what it is. And I'll leave you with this message. Quite often, we spend an inordinate amount of time placing our energy on fighting for the old, when in reality, we should genuinely focus on building the new. Thanks so much for having me. Enjoy the rest of the session, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Take care.